Welcome to the Progressive Era. So, we just wrapped up Unit 8, which covered the Second Industrial Revolution and also the period we talked about, the Gilded Age, which is basically happening at the exact same time as the Second Industrial Revolution. And if you remember, during the Second Industrial Revolution, there were lots of drastic changes in the daily lives of Americans. We had an increase in population, an increase in immigration, an increase in factory work and labor. And paired with all of those, there were a lot of things that weren't so great about life, especially for those Americans that were very poor. So the progressive era is a response to that. We have all of these problems in society. What can we possibly do to fix all of those things? So that's what we're going to be looking at. This is the turn of the century. So the progressive era technically starts from 1890 to 1920. Okay, so this person you see here, this is Theodore Roosevelt, and he is president after the assassination of William McKinley, and he kind of becomes the face of the progressive movement, where he sees the ills of society and he wants to help change things. So our lesson objectives today, we're going to explain the need and define what the progressive era is, and explain what major wins the progressive era made in the lives of all Americans. So the origins of progressivism. The progressive had their roots in some early political parties like the Labor Party and the Populist Party. The Populist Party failed at becoming one of the major political parties, but the changes that many populists were seeking for at this time lived on in the rise of progressives. When you think of that word progress, right, progress means moving forward. So the progressives wanted to move life forward. The purpose of the movement was that the powers of government could be used to help solve political, economic, and social problems. That it could be the job of the government to pass laws to regulate things that were happening that weren't great for people. So the progressives had four goals. They wanted to protect the social welfare of society. They wanted to promote moral improvement, meaning people would live better lives. They also wanted to create economic reform and foster more efficiency in the daily lives of Americans, and then also reform the corruption that existed in government and politics at the time. So, the first thing, how they were going to protect social and moral welfare. They begin to target some things about people's lives that they don't really like, especially in terms of alcohol use. So, the temperance movement, which we talked a little bit about in the reform movements, um, will start to grow during this time, where we want to prohibit alcohol. Saloons where people would hang out to drink alcohol are seen as, terrible, evil places, not places where people hang out, but places that, are bad for society. Carrie Nation, that you see in the picture here, she was a leader of the temperance movement. She would actually take an axe and go into saloons and bars and would use an axe to chop the bar to pieces. Some reformers feel that the answer to society's problems was people's personal behaviors. They wanted to prohibit alcohol, like I said, so this will start to see the rise of the temperance movement. And that's paired with the moral movement, because people will act like better humans and be on better behavior if they're not drunk off of booze. Thirdly, we want to create economic reform. So obviously, we talked about those major captains of industry and the giant monopolies that they had created. We see a panic, an economic panic in 1893, that prompts some Americans to question our economic system. As a result, some workers, people in the working poor class, are going to embrace an idea of socialism, where there's a communal ownership of goods and services. So social programs today would be like public education, right? That's a social good that all of us are responsible for. You can also think about welfare is a social good, something that the government owns and organizes and is offered to the people as a service. Eugene Debs will organize the first American Socialist Party, but just like many major third parties in the United States, it will not have great success. One of the things that progressives did was exposed a lot of corruption that was happening in business and government. And how this happened was through journalism, through writers covering things that were happening in the world. these journalists became known as muckrakers. They exposed corruption in business. They thought we should make society more efficient and not reject the idea of capitalism. Ida Tarbell will expose Standard Oil's cutthroat methods in limiting competition, which will eventually lead to the government stepping in to stop them. How would the government foster efficiency? Many progressive leaders put their faith in scientific principles to make society better. This is when we'll start to see, different scientists doing research, using studies to improve factories and how to, be efficient in the way that we operate and the way that we do things. Under people across the United States, we also begin to regulate big business by passing different laws, putting taxes on corporations, regulating the railroad business because these businesses are not there to make large sums of money, but we should also be, again, doing things for the people that work very well. Another way that the government operated in regulating is we're going to start to protect working children. You can see from these photographs, there were no child labor laws. So pretty much any child, especially poor children, many of them were forced to work in very horrendous working conditions. They're more prone to accidents than adults are. And we basically begin to realize that these are kids. Like, we can't send these little tiny humans out into the world. We should probably protect them, and they should be in school instead of, working in a factory 24/7. So many progressive reformers will work to end child labor. Nearly every state had limited or banned child labor by 1918. So today, obviously, there's regulations in place. If you want to get a job, you have to be a certain age and get a worker's permit, especially if you're still a student, in order to get a job. Also, the progressives wanted to limit hours that workers were first forced to work. They succeed in winning workers' compensation to aid families of injured workers. So, if somebody gets injured on a job and they can't go to work, we still should support them and support, what can we do to make sure that their family still eats and they can still pay their bills. Obviously, maybe you've heard of like workman's compensation. So if you get hurt at work, either your job or the government will help to support you and your family during that time period. The Supreme Court also enacted and strengthened laws reducing women's time in a workplace so that they could be at home. Politically, the progressives need to firstly clean up local government. Local government at this time was extremely corrupt. It was very much a system where people rewarded their friends with jobs, and oftentimes did not really worry about listening to the citizens in towns and cities. Um, you have large numbers of immigrants, and whose issue or job is it to control them or influence them in local governments? So progressives first gained strength at the city and state level. Urban issues, I mean, you had trash in the streets, you had no sewage systems. So that's going to be a local thing to tackle, that cities are going to have to clean themselves up and become places for change. Um, there's a perception at this time that any city was a social menace that was full of disorder and chaos. It was overcrowded, polluted, lots of illness because of that poor sanitation. You also have the rise of immigrants that are nearly doubling the nation's population, settling in the cities as the rich people who have the means to are moving out to the suburbs. So one of the early progressive actions passed in order to take on corruption is the Pendleton Civil Service Act. So basically, this is the beginning of the civil service exam that's actually still in place today. If you want to work for the government as a firefighter or a police officer or another job like a postal worker, you have to take the civil service exam. And what your score is that you get on the civil service exam determines what type of jobs that you can get for local government. It says, this person is qualified. You're not getting the job because of the person that you know or you're related to. You get the job because you've shown through this exam that you're able to do it. It's on the merit system, right? You get a good score, you'll get a good job. Other problems in the cities were not organized to handle new issues. The early solution, we used a system of political machines where lots of corruption. If you lost your job, you'd go to the person in charge to help. In return, you would vote for whoever that person was and tells you to vote. But this led to widespread fraud, and someone could rise to powerful positions, but it was often through bribery. So we begin strengthening local governments because they can do things more efficiently, have a bid system in place. They decide things for the common good. So you have cities that become in charge of utility rates, um, bargaining with companies for lower rates, you know, streetcars, companies taking things over, having the government run things in order to make things more efficient, meaning they operate easier and also make things more possible or affordable to the working person. We talked about tenement housing in lesson 4, where we studied some photographs for Jacob Riis, who documented life in lower class cities in the book How the Other Half Lives. We'll be doing a few more document analysis and document investigation later on this week. Local leaders also felt that they didn't need to stop at immigration. Employers felt little responsibility toward their workers, especially immigrants. So you had charitable organizations like the Salvation Army and the YMCA that would take on roles to help serve the immigrant community. Lastly, we'll talk about election reform. Citizens fought for secret ballots, referendum votes that at things votes could be approved by the people. So for instance, Massachusetts was one of those places where we pass referendum votes sometimes where the vote to legalize marijuana in Massachusetts was actually a referendum vote where the people themselves voted and approved the passage of that referendum. Citizens also can recall officials if they deem someone corrupt. Citizens can petition and get initiatives on ballots. So if you think that something needs to change, you have to get enough signatures, and whatever you think could change, you individually could put together something to get changed. These different changes made government a lot more powerful for the people and not so much the people that were in government. Other accidents at different factories will also prompt reform. This building you see on the left is the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory. It catches fire, and hundreds of women were trapped in the building, and there were no kind of regulations or fire codes or anything like that in place. So this prompted the city of New York to pass labor laws, safety standards, have inspections at job places to make sure that where people are working is safe, and they wouldn't have a disaster like the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory happen. So we'll be doing a little document analysis this week on the Progressive Era. We'll also be doing an Ed puzzle that reviews a lot of what I said here as well. And then you'll take your mastery check.